first question is, how would you and your community define what it means to be a good neighbor?
So before I answer the question, Steve, I have to thank Reverend Pierce. I just have to, and you, for the invitation. You're not the strange ones. We are from our perspective. So when you say thank you for welcoming your strangeness, I don't know what you're talking about, but thank you for being kind to ours. And I must say to the congregation and to others around, you are really blessed and fortunate, at least from my perspective as an outsider, to have Reverend Pierce at the helm. So I don't want to steer the question away, but I did feel a need to say that. So thank you for having me, and I'm really excited to join you to kick off this program. Sorry about that. Would you be able to ask that question again?
Absolutely. How would you and your community define what it means to be a good neighbor?
Yes. So if I was going to speak about a good neighbor in the Jewish tradition, and I'm coming from an Orthodox Jewish tradition, which I think people have particular conceptions about Orthodox Judaism as well. So that's just one small niche within the Jewish community. We would tend to define it, I think, in three scriptural ways. There are three scriptural sources that sort of form the bedrock of the principles that help determine kind of neighborliness. Sounds academic, but I think it is practiced, which is why I'm sharing these three. The first is Exodus 23:9. You may or may not be familiar with it, but just in case, let me read it. You shall not oppress a stranger, for you know the feelings of the stranger, having yourselves been strangers in the land of Egypt. So this is the first piece, which is powerful. The whole point of the notion of servitude in Egypt and leaving, which is one of the fundamental mythologies of Judaism. There are probably two sort of biblical myths. By myths, I mean not things that aren't true, but epic stories that form the basis for so many of our values, norms, and practices. And one of them is creation, the creation in 7 days, and the other is the Exodus from Egypt. So many rituals that we perform, when we perform them, we declare in remembrance of leaving Egypt before doing it. And so it's very clear to us that it's Zecher L'Yetziat Mitzrayim, it's in memory of leaving Egypt. And so here's one example in the Bible of a commandment to love the stranger. A word about stranger, in Hebrew it's ger, and the word for ger in our tradition can mean one of two things. Can mean an immigrant, someone that doesn't share the nationality but is living in the locality. So in the case of Israelites first having dominion in their own land, it means as you have your own autonomy for the first time in ancient Israel, be sure to be kind to those who are living in the land of biblical Israel, but who are not Israelites like you, just as you were strangers in the land of Egypt, and they accused you of being conspiracy theorists and plotting a revolt against the Egyptian government, and then enslaved you and used that as a justification. So that's the first piece. I will say that most of our history as Jews is less autonomy and more stranger. Egypt has been sort of the norm for us, I think, historically, and in our collective historical memory as much as anything else. Functionally, what this means is empathy for those that are not here, as opposed to blaming them or finding fault. I'll I guess, highlight or emphasize that we read a portion of the Torah of the 5 books of Moses each week in synagogue, and we've just been reading the sections dealing with the Exodus. And in the Exodus, the Egyptians and Pharaoh, a new Pharaoh, say, hey, they're foreigners, lest they revolt and join enemies when they attack, let's enslave these foreigners. So the fear in the Exodus is that we're different. Therefore, we are a political threat. Therefore, let us do violence to these people to keep them subjugated and keep them down. And of course, in that narrative, it winds up backfiring classically as God powerfully shows the force of redemption from that sort of thing. So for us, that's the narrative that we tell ourselves a lot. And so being a good neighbor means empathy with those who don't share the country of origin, or perhaps the customs of the place, or even the values of the place, which is where the challenge comes in, right? And also trying to empathize and noting the urge to find fault with. Oh, they don't share our values, they're a threat. I think that urge is a normal human outgroup bias, right? It's kind of evolutionary. And so to say we don't have it would be, I think, fake. And so I think this is fighting against presumptive bias that could be present, and is a powerful norm to teach us when someone is a stranger, love them. Ger can also mean convert. It can also mean someone that converts to the religion. So within our religious tradition, that also means people that choose to become Jewish for whatever reason, though it's not limited to that group or even explicitly thought of. So that's the first neighbor piece. You were slaves, you know suffering, and not just slaves. Right? For us, and this is, I think, an important part of the Jewish ethos for folks to understand, it's the Spanish Inquisition, which is a traumatic event in Jewish historical memory, and it's the Crusades. There were 3 German communities, Jewish communities of Mainz, Speyer, and Worms that were totally sacked, and most of the population was killed as crusaders came to liberate the Holy Land at that time. And so for us, the Crusades is not really about what the Crusades was about, a war between Christianity and Islam and that whole thing. For us, the Crusades is, and they killed us on the way. That's the memory we have of it. And then it's the Holocaust. And before the Holocaust, it's the sort of little known wars that are not important to other people are prominent events in our history, like the Khmelnytsky revolt in Poland, which wiped out over 50% of the Jewish community there before that, and Russian persecution of Jews originally, and then in the communist era with other religions too. We weren't alone there. So for us, the history of sort of being othered and persecution and being the kind of, I don't mean this in the wrong way, but kind of the queer group of the world. I think that's a fair way the Jews kind of relate to themselves as kind of other and strange, or we were related in those ways. We couldn't own land in most societies. We often couldn't have many jobs and had to be money changers or money lenders and other things. So a lot of the industries, even that Jewish people find them in, are kind of, we were classically relegated to those industries because they had bad repute. And so
let me just
I'm kind of going on, but yeah.
So who are the people that make up the community that you work with and are part of? Because I think that's just our discussion. So, you know, who is the community?
Yeah, who is the community? Great question. So our community has, let me define in a couple of ways in splits, and I'll kind of overview them to give you more information rather than less, but feel free to ask in the questions or now if you have more specific questions. So there's Mizrahim, or sometimes called Sephardic Jews. Those are Jews who, you know, we spread all over the world as a diaspora. So we identify ourselves by where our ancestors came from, the country of origin. Since this is actually a good segue. Immigration is so essential to our story that where we emigrated from is how we identify, even in terms of customs, prayer, liturgy. So Sephardic Jews came from Spain or the Middle East, Iraq, Iran. Those are Persian Jews, really a separate group, but part of it, Syria, North Africa, Tunisia, Morocco, Palestine. Any of those areas that Jews came from are Sephardic Jews. They're actually most of the world Jewish population, but a small minority in the United States. So I think most people presume that Jews are sort of Central, Western, or Eastern European. Those are Ashkenazic Jews who came from either France, Germany, England, Amsterdam, Western Europe, or Poland and Russia in Eastern Europe. Those are Ashkenazic Jews, which I think our cuisine, I'm an Ashkenazi Jew, you know, bagels and lox and smoked fish and those things are more known in the American culture, comedians, the comedy industry. You know, people know Ashkenazic Jews, I think. I think they know Middle Eastern Jews or Sephardic Jews less, but in Israel, that's the majority. So that's one kind of distinction, Ashkenazic and Sephardic. Another is Jews by choice and Jews by birth. So we allow but don't promote conversion. So you can convert to becoming Jewish, or sometimes called becoming a Jew by choice. And that represents a significant subsection of our community. I know in my congregation, that represents almost a third of the membership of the congregation. And in other congregations, it's comparable or even higher. So that's a very large section of the Jewish community. Our members are young and old. In our specific community, we have people who are in their 90s or even hundreds, and a large group of young, committed. So modern Orthodox Jews, you say who's in your community, tend to be a specific subsection. We're the group that's Orthodox. We keep all of the laws strictly, but we view the general culture as primarily positive and view progress and progressive ideas. And we have a distinctively positive reaction as opposed to viewing insularity as a better response to modernity. So we're, I think, a lesser known group of Orthodox Jews that dress more like regular looking people and education, regular jobs, not as opposed to Hasidic or ultra Orthodox communities that people are more familiar with. But we keep all of the laws just as strictly and view the religion in a very strict way. There's a lot of the Orthodox community in the United States is modern Orthodox, in Israel too. So there's a lot of young folk in the modern Orthodox community, increasingly because of a younger generational progressive trend. So our community within the Orthodox world is kind of well situated. So we've been having a boom of kind of young professionals and also young families and individuals engaged in the recent years. I will say that who else is in our community? There's some Middle Eastern Jews in particular tend not to consider themselves white as much. Like if you're from Syria or Lebanon or North Africa, because there was so much conversion, intermarriage, rape in parts of our history, Jews tended to adopt the phenotype over time of the location where they were. So, my family came from a combination of Germany and Russia, and as a result, I look like it. But if my friend whose family came from Syria looks just like other people who are Syrian. So in terms of race, it's an interesting, if I would try and identify the group that way, our community is also gay and straight and every other sort of version of that. I think people are surprised always to find that out, but we have, over 10 openly gay members of our congregation. So it's fair to say that our community also has members who are gay and members who are trans. And so that is part of our congregation. We have one Black member who looks Black, and most of us look white.
So what are some of the challenges that you face, with integrating with the community as a whole?
Yeah. So there are a couple of different major challenges. Some of them are very pragmatic. We only eat kosher food. So that doesn't just mean there are dietary laws. I don't know if people are familiar with the dietary laws or not, but functionally that means it's very hard to eat a meal in someone else's home or to go out to a restaurant to eat if it's not certified as kosher and only serving kosher food. Since we view integration as a good thing, I started a kosher certification agency so that there'd be more restaurants in the local region for people to go out to. So now there's the Garden Grill or a couple of others in the Providence area that are kosher certified. But eating food is a big barrier. Another major barrier to integration is Shabbat and holidays. For 25 hours, sundown on Friday to an hour after sundown on Saturday, we don't use electronics or technology. We have a strict Sabbath in that way, and we cut off. I'd like to say we pretend as if everything is done. Or in the way some, maybe we'll find commonality here, the way some Hasidic thinkers say it, as if the Messiah has already come. Is how we say it. So even though maybe our religions have different views on that, but on Shabbat at least, our attitude is that it's the Messianic era here for at least 25 hours. So as a result, that's a pretty big barrier because a lot of people, even if they're respectful of what that means, it's hard for folks when there are work obligations on a Saturday or, hey, can't you just make an exception? Or for us, we view that as a biblical death penalty, not that we're running around stoning people and executing them, but the weight of guilt is that for us. And so we wouldn't dare violate the Sabbath absent, life-saving medical emergency or something like that. And people teach, it's not just a thing we do that we care a lot about. We treat it as a serious legal obligation. The same for holidays. I think one of the harder things for integration in the United States, and Jews kind of maybe complain about this privately to themselves, but I think it is important to kind of share, is surrounding our holidays, the rest of the country isn't celebrating holidays. So it sounds silly, but it means that on Rosh Hashanah, for example, the Jewish New Year, you have to try and get time off from work when no one else is off. And even if you can get time off from work, no one understands that this is your biggest holiday of the year. And so you have 20 family members coming over pre-COVID and have to cook a whole feast. And so the feeling is like, well, before Christmas, everyone knows that everyone's doing it. Or on Thanksgiving, which is kind of a secular religious holiday, there's a general understanding, but we're doing these holidays and people don't understand that if you schedule a work meeting late the night before, well, that's our holiday prep, So it's a small kind of thing, but it is, I think, something that Jews sometimes feel like, oh, people don't realize that our major holidays, don't have vacations associated with them. Right. And that makes it just a lot harder and stressful in the best cases. The biggest barrier to integration, though, is anti-Semitism or the fear of it. I can't say how many Jews don't wear the kippah, I'm wearing it underneath, but wear hats or other things simply to try and cover up their Jewish identity. All of us walk around and know what it's like to get something thrown at us or to be cursed at by a car passing by or to have someone angrily yell at us, "Hail Hitler," or things like that. Maybe not to the extent that I think the Black community experiences a lot of that, but even though we're white, if we're out wearing Jewish dress or symbols or going to synagogue, we're quite familiar with that, all of us. And so I think that always leads us to wonder who we can trust. And so that's definitely a barrier to kind of integration because we're kind of reserved. We don't know, we're trying to size up. Are you friend or foe? It doesn't lead to a very inclusive, so we perpetuate it. I think it's a dynamic.
Who do you consider the vulnerable members of your community, and how did your community understand its responsibility, for these members?
Yeah, so I think like other groups, so being Jewish is both a privilege, I think, for most of us. Like we viewed as Jews are well liked in surveys and looked up to in some ways collectively, but also anti-Semitic attacks per capita are, I think, the highest of any group. And there's a lot of anti-Semitism and increasing anti-Semitism. The last 4 years has been dramatic and obvious increases for us. So Jewish is a vulnerability. So when you multiply Jewish vulnerability with other vulnerability, you get kind of special vulnerability. I would say in those groups are who you might suspect. Black Jews have it hard, both because they're othered even within our community, right? In this sense, we're white, right? And so it's hard to be a Black Jew. People are always wondering, did you convert? Why do you look Black? Like, because most of us are not, and so there's and so people feel forced to tell their story or defend or explain their identity. But then they're also vulnerable in the ways that Black people are generally vulnerable, and in the ways that Jewish people are vulnerable, or queer Jews, trans Jews. I think all of these categories just kind of women. So whoever's vulnerable in society, when they're Jewish, I think that just kind of serves as a coefficient of sorts of the vulnerability. It's like, oh, you're Black and you're Jewish. I have one guy who, when his boss learned he's Jewish, he said, "You're Black and you're Jewish? That sucks." Like, in other words, man, you're a double hate target, So I think that's kind of, an accurate assessment. In addition to other, there's the classic biblical categories, widow, orphan. But I would say these are the particular vulnerabilities in the modern.
So what would you say to those who are not accepting your values, norms, ethics, lifestyle? What would you say to them?
Yeah. This is really hard. I think what we would say to those who are not accepting of our norms and values is this basic thing, and I've said it to people. I had an occasion once to meet with a white supremacy group in some kind of facilitated dialogue by the Anti-Defamation League. And I think what I said is, I know you have certain perceptions about us collectively and that you're transferring those individually, but we've been around for, about 3,000 years and we've survived. So at the very least, give us a chance. We might be wrong on certain things and we're open to that, but we've also learned a few things from being around the block. And, maybe you could reframe or try and appreciate some of what those might be. I think for most people that disagree with our decisions or don't accept our values or cultural norms or have prejudices against Jewish people, it's like anything, personal relationships tend to break those down. So I think I would say, actually, you know what I would say? Let me revise the answer. What I would say is, let's put the differences aside and have a Sabbath dinner together. And let's talk about everything but those things and just get to know what we all care about. And I think that's probably the way to, if I was really in dialogue with someone who was strongly opposed to some measure of my identity, how I would respond.
I think we can always get together and relate over food. I think that is always a good way that everybody sort of agrees that food is a good equalizer for
yes
communities. And I'll be the first to agree, and it shows. What wisdom would you share with a community of faith like ours of how we could, how could we be a good neighbor?
So let me just clarify that. Do you mean to us or in general?
Both. So to you, to your community directly, as hey, we've reached out. So how can we do that? And I'll add to that. I'm going to add a second question to that. So what wisdom would you share to that? And two, how might we partner to with you and your work with your community? So how might we both learn to work together, but also how can we partner? How can we help?
I appreciate that. So one way to be a good neighbor to the Jewish community, I'll answer both parts of this, like good neighbor from a Jewish wisdom perspective, and then good neighbor to us. And thank you for asking. It's so sweet to be asked this question. I don't know if other people are sensing that, but it's a very, I appreciate the feeling. It comes clearly from a place of love and curiosity and kindness. So thank you. I think to know that Jews are collectively, we have intergenerational trauma. So I don't mean to say you should look at us like, oh, poor them, but I think we very much self-relate as trauma victims, and it's been hard. We've, in earshot of recent memory, there have been multiple attempts to wipe out our entire people. Almost all of us have relatives and family members who have died at the hands of, genocidal regimes, wars, and torture directed specifically at Jews for being Jews. So I think we have a kind of sometimes a fairly abrasive, bunkered mindset. And to be gentle with us is one way of saying, like we've been through a lot and we're not over it or nearly over it. And a lot of it still exists in much less a degree than it once did. It's hard to imagine Nazi Germany occurring now. And yet there have been multiple shootings in synagogues in the last 4 years, such that, now most of us have had to do active shooter trainings just to attend synagogue on an annual basis and pretend and, run for exits and have security barriers and know who's got the gun in the congregation and these sorts of things. And so that does trigger the trauma and the way that people who relive trauma feel it's still ongoing because it's so much a part of our liturgy and our collective memory. So that's one way to be a good neighbor, is I think to be kind of gentle about that. Another thing to know in that regard, I think, is the role of Israel. A lot of times Jews in my community are doing progressive social action or social justice work very much and very often. There's a lot of times where the moment comes where we feel a little othered when the topic of Israel it comes up, because it tends to be that in social justice circles, there's a fairly critical view of Israel advanced. Most of us, have interesting relationships with Israel as a place we love, as a safe haven, and have passionate religious and cultural feelings toward, and also critiques of it. I don't think most of us think it's perfect, but we do view sort of critiques of Israel in other settings, like settings where we're trying to work on racial justice and the topic comes up as a distraction in a way that other people wouldn't. In other words, we don't feel that if a Chinese person came to a social justice rally that, you know, forgetting whether the legitimacy of the claims, that claims about Chinese human rights and Uyghur oppression would be something that that person would have to confront at that setting. But it is something Jews often have to confront. And oftentimes we confront in ways we feel are wildly distorted or inaccurate. And I think objectively are frequently. So that's, not to say there's not legitimate criticism or debate to occur, but to know that that's a kind of always a red flag for us. Sometimes it's anti-Semitic, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's accurate, sometimes it's not. But it is a regular issue for us. And so to think if Israel is coming up, whatever your views are, like, is this important to what's occurring now to group this in? Because if there are Jewish people here that have really strong personal feelings about Israel, maybe their family members were saved only because of the existence of the state of Israel, is this going to cause them to feel like, well, maybe I'm not welcome in this space? And is that the way to kind of have allyship? In terms of offer, there is one piece, and maybe first, love your neighbor as yourself, comes in the context in Leviticus of you should surely rebuke your neighbor. Don't hate your neighbor in your heart. That's the context. You should love your neighbor as yourself. And so the rabbinic teaching is any neighborliness that doesn't have rebuke associated with it isn't really neighborliness. It's superficial. That's what the rabbis of the Talmud said. So there's this interesting idea that, any real loving relationship, as most people know, like with your closest relatives, you can critique the people closest to you. They don't always react well to it. But those are specifically the people you can say something critical to, and they might actually take it seriously, or they're going to care because they're in relationship with you and they're committed to making it work. Right. And so whether they perceive it as objectively correct or not, but they want it to work, and it's a sign that things aren't working. So that's a kind of rabbinic view of neighborliness, that real neighborliness, when it's warm, can have a little reality to it. So that's a kind of Jewish view of neighborliness that's a little less. Our neighbors aren't always so polite, but they are friendly. And that comes from love. Real love isn't always super polite, I guess, is the Jewish teaching. Maybe you agree, maybe you don't, but that is a rabbinic teaching about it. In terms of joining in the work, we always say, all of us say, the best way to reduce so many prejudices is to work in expanded coalitions and kind of increase the circle of diversity in who's participating, right? So in other words, we have all these discussions in the Jewish community. How should we deal with anti-Semitism? Anti-Semitism's rising, and everyone knows in the Jewish community, it's not a secret. The best way to deal with anti-Semitism is to be out there, to be engaging, to make more friends, to be collaborating, for us to ask, if we work with the Black community to help them achieve racial justice, well, that's not an anti-Semitism strategy. That's not why we're doing it. But if in fact we do that, then Black people are going to care when there's anti-Semitism. But that's just the nature of friendships, is that people are there for each other in ways that don't have to be tit for tat exactly because they care about the other person, but they are there reciprocally, and everyone knows that. So I think the best way to work together is to work together in person, which is so hard in COVID during these times, right? But
maybe one of the takeaways is, once we are out of COVID, we get together as two congregations and have a dinner, and then we start that way and have everybody communicating what's going on and share some of the shared values and things we have about that. So maybe an option. So let me pivot to another question, and this is the one that I came up with this morning. I know it's been challenging the last number of years, and over the last year and a half, more so. But what has been sort of the most pleasant surprise you've found out of all the strife and everything? Let's put a positive spin on what we've seen, and and what have been the good.
Yeah, there's a famous teaching of the Kutzker Rebbe, a great Hasidic Rebbe. It's a very Jewish teaching, and all historically Jewish, everything Jewish. Ein shalem milev shavor. There's nothing so whole as a broken heart. He was known to suffer from depression. But oh, I think actually in a kind of um, ironic way, when everything falls apart, um, we're able to see um, vulnerability that we share, interconnection that is at the foundation of spiritual truth, right? That all of us are created by at each moment and now the same God. So whatever our differences, the very same energy causes all of us to exist as a manifestation of that life-giving force at any moment. And so in that way, if we fight against each other, we're kind of like one unit or one body beating itself up, and it becomes silly. I think that realization has become palpable with COVID, which is to say that you can't leave poor countries out of a vaccination plan because you will get sick. That's a selfish way of looking at it. But the deeper way of looking at it is we're all in it together. Wealthier countries don't have redder blood than other countries. Or as the Talmud likes to say, how do you know whose blood is redder in these sorts of questions, right? So, in other words, everyone's of infinite dignity and value before God. I also think that climate change is, I don't like calling it climate change. I prefer catastrophe because that's what it is. Change implies something neutral or different and non-urgent. There's an ongoing climate catastrophe which is accelerating, and the collective action or scope of collective action required, I think, needs a spiritual underpinning. That kind of radical value shift in the world required for our collective thriving and survival won't happen without some spiritual underpinning to it. And I think that this actually makes that more possible or probable. I don't think that before COVID, I had a sense that the world could get together and collaborate to try and solve problems that required great sacrifice, tremendous spending, reordering of societies, examining basic values and changing some of them. And now the United States is distributing cash payments to many of its citizens in the trillions of dollars. And that was done, with a particular government that was less favorable to it. So I still don't know. I think I have more hope. I think I have more hope that we're maybe up to some of the challenges, though I fear it's too late. But that's a thing from the last.
Excellent. I'd like to now ask Pastor David if there's any questions that have come in from the audience, yeah. and maybe we can ask some of those.
One of the good.
I forgot something I want to say.
Sure.
One way you can partner with us if you want, that's really palpable, is we run a soup kitchen, Judy's Kindness Kitchen, on Sunday mornings. Now it's limited because of COVID-19, like 10 people in masks and separate corners with no talking. But it's a really great project. When it was going, it was about 30 to 40 people, all ages, on Sunday mornings, and many different backgrounds, some from the synagogue, maybe a quarter, but many not, fraternity from a university, or people looking to get credit for a school on a project, many Jewish, many not Jewish, but our synagogue runs at Judy's Kindness Kitchen, and it's a very tangible, easy way to, you cook soup and make sandwiches, and then a select group of those people go to Crossroads, which is in Providence, the homeless shelter, and serve the food. So, post-COVID, when we reopen it and kind of try and get people, if you're interested.
So we'd like to reciprocate on an invitation. We actually will do a program called Mobile Loaves.
Okay.
We actually get together as a congregation and make sandwiches, hot meals and everything. And we actually fill a food truck full of food and clothes.
You have a food truck, so you're doing it in the hipster way, and we're like old school going,
Think of a canteen truck, and we will go in Woonsocket and feed 120 to 130 people in about an hour and a half. And
let us trade soup kitchen experiences.
For those of you that have done that, you could raise your hand. It's an amazing event, and we would love to extend that offer once the food truck starts a rolling to get you engaged, because it really means a lot to the local community. It's a great way to give back, and you're interacting directly with those people. So great.
Not to create more events for post-COVID when we've also learned that some of us like to be homebodies, but I do think it might be nice to get these two sort of pretty similar ventures with the goal of feeding those that don't have food with good, dignified meals together for some kind of interesting anything. I don't know what, but seems like an obvious overlap.
I think it's before I bring up a question, and we have several that came in through the chat box, but just for those of you who actually are part of the congregation of Four Corners in Cumberland, I think it's important for us to acknowledge that an Orthodox Jewish rabbi just said that we are hipster. Something that probably has never been said before, right? About
You
the
have a
white
food
clapboard
truck.
church at the corner of Angel Road in Cumberland. We're the hip congregation now.
Well, they did say that about Dennis Aiken, but not the rest.
No, of course not. But we're the hip.
You have a food truck.
One of the questions that came in, Rabbi, was this: you spoke of several challenges in the Jewish community and in Jewish practice, around integration. But you spoke most notably of anti-Semitism, and you used the word trust. Someone raised this question: how do you practice trust in a world with anti-Semitism?
Yeah, so one of the deep. I'm getting an echo. I don't know if it's gone. I think. Yeah, it's good now. One of the deep challenges, and I think something as a rabbi I'm always working with in my congregation, is as a result of anti-Semitism, people harden in our community, and it's an understandable response, but it makes them less empathic because they're afraid, and it makes people quicker to judge, and it really, it's not just bad for us, like because it's bad to be hated, but it affects you in ways that are spiritually negative. It closes you. So I don't know if I'm taking the question personally, how do we practice trust? And the answer is it requires a lot of work and not always successfully. Not always successfully. If the answer is how would you, yeah, I think that's, is that, I don't know if the person who asked wants to clarify, but one of the ways is I think when we learn we can, when we see that it's possible. One thing that caused great trust, I'll give a tangible example, is after the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting, Mufti Ikram, who's the Mufti, kind of the chief judge for the Islamic community in Rhode Island, he's out in Smithfield, I think, or Lincoln, and he came and gave an impassioned talk at our vigil. Impassioned. I mean, he was crying. And that wasn't taken as for granted because I think people knew his views on Israel-Palestine, and he had come under some fire from the Jewish community just a few years earlier for expressing views that were very much anathema to our community on that issue. He gained so much trust on that day, not for changing political views, which I don't believe he has, but for clearly empathizing and feeling the pain of our community and being there. Not to say everyone always has to be, people have families and jobs and people don't, but the fact that he was there in that way and that vulnerable and open to it, I think every person in the Jewish community views him as someone they can trust now. The whole Jewish community was there post-Pittsburgh. We had thousands of people in a way that we don't usually, because that was kind of a watershed moment for us. The synagogue shooting at Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, and he gave the most powerful speech of all. And we had people that were in the synagogue while it was shot who came and spoke, but his was the one that stood out. So
it speaks to that. It speaks to that empathy. I was just going to say that, yeah, the empathy that you were making such a good deal of before. Yeah. This is a good opportunity for you, perhaps. But one of the questions that came in was about your interest in human trafficking. And I was going to actually ask you to give the one, sort of a 1-minute sales pitch on your bread business there. But to a more significant and serious level, Lynn asked the question, what, if anything, can you tell us about the current state of human trafficking in the state of Rhode Island?
Yes. So I can say a few things. Maybe I'll start with that, which is, you want to see the state of trafficking in human trafficking in Rhode Island. There are two things you could note. One, just a few months ago, there were a band of people. Maybe some of you saw them. Maybe they came to your homes. I don't know where people live, if everyone's in Massachusetts or if anyone's in Rhode Island, but there were people knocking on doors selling magazine subscriptions with the idea that the proceeds from these magazine subscriptions would support a local YMCA or something of the sort, that some of the money would go there. I don't know if anyone saw or had any of these people come to your door. I was working one night on the website for our human trafficking business. This was a very poignant moment when the knock came on the door. And actually, since we're doing research into the modalities of human trafficking, we learned that this is one of the things going on now in the US. Vulnerable people, particularly girls, particularly from either situations of abuse, people are on the street. So why are they there? Are picked up by people that promise them money and jobs. Usually they take away their identity, take away their cell phones, and they travel across the country with this kind of ruse. It doesn't really make sense, meaning their pitch doesn't make sense, but they are trafficked. They are often sex slaves or other things. Sometimes they are given drugs to feed addiction in exchange for collecting money and giving it to these, overlords, and they move on and is in an area on. So they knocked on our door 2 or 3 nights in a row as we were working on this curriculum, and it was really hard. I asked the questions I knew to ask because I was working on a curriculum. Are you safe? Do you have somewhere to go? Is there anything I can do? And one of them said something to me that was really sad but true, which is, are you going to take me in? Are you going to give me the drugs I'm hooked on? No. So don't pretend to help me. And when I asked, are you safe? And that was a really real response. Like, yeah, she's right. I'm not in a position to. So that was crushing, to know that it's real and it's happening here. You can also drive on North Main Street in Providence around 6th or something like that. There's a spa, Lucky Day Spa or something like that. And, they've been busted for trafficking a few times. You can see because they own the properties near it and the windows are all boarded up because it's where they keep people. So you can tell when there are adjacent properties to a spa with boarded up windows, you know what it is. That's a telltale sign, telltale industry, telltale sign of trafficking, multiple homes there. And there's not much you can do because when you report it to law enforcement, so here in Rhode Island, Aaron Weissman is the federal prosecutor in Rhode Island, and he's actually one of the heads of the federal prosecutor's task force on trafficking. So he said, you don't want to report it, Rabbi. I spoke to him. He said, because if you report it, what are law enforcement going to do? They're going to arrest the women for sex crimes, and the men who are connected politically, financially, whatever, mafia, whatever it is, are going to get off. So you're just going to wind up hurting women who are already, abused. So and he's right, bad law enforcement, but so that's a progressive law enforcement take, right? It's not to prosecute, and that's the right angle. So what I can say about the state in Rhode Island is that people think it's not here. It's in India, it's in Bangladesh, it's in Myanmar, it's in wherever it is. It's here. There are about 30 million people who are trafficked right now. More than half of them are women and children. There are more than 100 in Rhode Island on average every year who are trafficked. And the key is empowerment, finding ways to empower people so that they can, when they're ready, if the opportunity presents itself, that they can seize it and reclaim their lives. The place doing the best work in Rhode Island is St. Mary's. Maybe people are familiar with St. Mary's home. They have a program called the STAR program, which works with survivors of human trafficking in Rhode Island, doing heroic work, getting people burner phones, meeting with them and letting them know what their options are, giving them a place to stay and food to eat if they decide they want to take that step. But in many ways, I think what people don't realize is that it's not that easy to leave because there's some reason you got in and there's a dependency, and people didn't always have great situations before. In fact, they usually don't. So either it's vulnerable. Yeah.
What's the connection? I mean, just speaking of black holes that feel like they're getting darker, what's the connection between your bakery and the profits that you take and human trafficking? How did that come to be, and what's the impact of that, would you say?
Yeah, so it came to be because Passover, we have this matzah, this flatbread associated with slavery, the bread of affliction, it's called, and we eat it on Passover. And I got annoyed when I read an article in the Wall Street Journal about the sale of Manischewitz, the largest commercial matzah bakery, to Bain Capital for some billions of dollars. Nothing against Mitt Romney, who's proven himself to be a fine patriot. Nothing against Mitt. The point is, who runs Bain Capital, but the idea that a matzah company, which is our religious ritual, was essentially a holding of a hedge fund for corporate profit, struck me as distorted at best. And so I was angry. My wife, who's my neighborly rebuker, told me, well, stop being angry about it. What are you going to do? So now I said, well, we should take the money in the profit margin and redirect it towards the purpose of Passover. So then we started interviewing people. Well, what do you think the purpose of Passover is? And they're like, well, freedom from slavery is the purpose of Passover. And was like, well, what's the right analog? And so we asked, what's the right analog to freedom from slavery? And we decided that freedom from slavery is the analog to freedom from slavery, because there are 30 million people who are enslaved at this moment. And we all bear responsibility. So let's take the profit. And we can't do anything. That's the other thing. Like, people come to my doors. I'm working on the project, and I still can do very little to help. So that's the hardest part, even when So I don't want to turn away in a kind of, because it's too hard to look, but there's little I can do. But what I can do is fund the underfunded people who are actually able to take the risk and have the training to help when people do that, right? Because there are dozens of people every year in Rhode Island who turn to St. Mary's as the only address, and they need funds desperately. They're wildly underfunded, and other organizations like that in every state and across the world. So that was what we decided was a way to kind of bridge the gap between ritual and social justice. Instead of the ritual inspiring you to go do some social justice, what if buying the ritual item was your social justice? Kind of make it easier. That was the concept. Yeah.
Yeah, great venture. So this question came in, and we probably have time for maybe just one or two more. But you spoke of climate catastrophe. And so someone asked the question, and you spoke of the need for spiritual underpinnings around climate catastrophe. What would be a Jewish spiritual underpinning for climate catastrophe?
There's two. One is we have 613 commandments in the Jewish tradition. Maybe you didn't know that, but we have a tradition that in the 5 books of Moses, there are 613 identifiable commandments. Most of them relate to the temple in Jerusalem and sacrifices. A Thanksgiving sacrifice is 60 loaves of bread, and these kinds of details in Leviticus, like several hundred. So there aren't that many. But one of them is you cannot destroy something. So the commentators explain, you can't waste. Bal tashchit in Hebrew. So the commentators explain it actually is rooted in a reverence for the earth. You can't waste things. So it's funny because the biblical commandment is kind of sweet in its innocence. It's like you can't destroy an item wastefully. You have to try and reuse things. It's so below the scale of what we're doing. It's so far, but it's like on an individual level, reuse the glass jar is not good, but it's the ethos, don't waste. But we just throw stuff out in our culture. So that's one kind of localized underpinning.
Recycle?
Recycle and reuse. And even recycling is so hard because most recycling isn't really recycled, as we've learned, right? And so that's the kind of local level. And I've been able to kind of, I think, pitch that because it's in our canon as a commandment. This is a commandment, so we've neglected it just like everyone else, right? We're not better at reusing and recycling than others, but it is we are obligated to do it. And it's not just a nice thing to do. It is an obligation, the same way that keeping kosher or Shabbat is an obligation. We just don't treat it that way for us. The other, I think, is more deep, which is that we like to say there's no place devoid of God's presence. We're all deeply interconnected. And the idea that it's zero sum, that if we decide to cut our emissions collectively, it will hurt our economy and China will have a competitive advantage. And these sorts of geopolitical calculations about climate catastrophe are fundamentally flawed in their orientation because they imagine that this is a zero sum game with winners and losers. But actually, unless we all win, we all lose. It's that kind of game. we all, we all lose, and not just all of us, but all things. So I actually view this as a needed wake-up call. It's kind of like Noah's flood in a sense, to the crimes of our generation about the ways in which we other and view other nations, other people, and the earth, and take for granted so much about our lifestyle. I think it also hits at our consumption culture, where even for, we joke, but like we have a daughter and people want to get her stuff for her birthday, and we're like, no, plant trees. Don't get her things. Things are just, she's happy. She's 2. She's happy to play with a cardboard box that's left over from our, like food delivery. That's not, didn't need much. The kids have imaginations. They don't need stuff. In fact, all this stuff we get, even innocently and kindly, all of it. I mean, greeting cards. Like we just have a culture of stuff, and we're gonna kill ourselves with our stuff. So yeah, that's a hard countercultural message, but it is a real one.
And one that is certainly at the heart of it, also about neighborliness.
Yeah, we are all neighbors.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's probably a great segue as we wrap up this evening. And there were more questions than what we could get to, but we expected that was going to be the case. But Rabbi, I wonder if as we wrap up tonight, if I might impose upon you in closing to read a passage or two for us from out of your sacred texts that were fitting to this discussion, and that you might perhaps read in Hebrew for us as we close.
Sure, I would love to do that. Oh, hi. I think my daughter wants to say goodnight to everyone, if that's okay.
Of course. We would love to meet her.
Say hi.
Hi. Thanks for coming in. We're so glad to have this time to spend with your dad tonight.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to just chant a passage from Leviticus then for you to. First of all, thank you. Let me say thank you. It's been such a treasure. When you visited, you're all so sweet. It meant a lot that you came. You came after a period of rough anti-Semitism, generally, and it was not taken for granted that you came. You visited. People in the congregation still talk about that class that visited and how you were there for us. Even people that weren't there, as you know, we were waiting for a prayer quorum. Most people weren't there, but they heard about you coming, and that's what they remember. It's a legend in our congregation. So thank you, and for this opportunity, I'm going to read a passage from Leviticus to close, which I'll read it in the English first and then in the Hebrew. When a stranger resides with you in your land, sorry. This is Leviticus 19, 17, and 18. You shall not hate your kinsfolk in your heart. Reprove your kinsman, but incur no guilt because of him. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against your countrymen. Love your fellow as yourself. I am the Lord. Lo tisna tachicha belvovecha, hocheach tochiach et amitecha. Lo tisa alav cheit, lo tikom velo titor et bnei amecha. Yahavta l'reacha kamocha, ani Adonai. Love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord.
Steve, thank you for moderating us this evening. One last word of thank you to Rabbi Dolinger. We are grateful for the opportunity to have this time with you. And friends, to each of you, go in peace. Shalom. And our next forum will be in about 2 weeks, the week of the 21st. And we hope that you'll join us again. So go in peace and good night.